Overcoming saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths, we must now face a new enemy, ourselves. With the rates of diseases such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, depression, and many others ballooning, we must find a better solution to these modern epidemics. Welcome to the Preventive Medicine Podcast. We believe in building a foundation of health by means of prevention so that you can build the life you want and find fulfillment with no barriers. Hear from experts around the country on how to take your health into your hands. Take control and build a foundation of health for the life that you want to live. And now, here's your host, Raghav Sharma. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you do, please don't hesitate to subscribe and like for all of our future content. All right, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Preventive Medicine Podcast. Today, I'm excited to bring to you Dr. Stephan Guyenet, as he promptly kind of informed me how to pronounce his name. Definitely would have butchered that if I did not ask him. But we are going to be talking about the science behind kind of hunger and food, and nutrition, and all that kind of stuff. And this is a unique outlook to nutrition, because typically we talk like calories, diets, fad diets, all these kinds of things. And now we're going to take like another look at that and kind of look at some of the brain's responses and how kind of our food structure and environments were set up. So Dr. Guyenet, welcome to the show.
All right. Thanks for having me on, Raghav.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you fell into the world of nutrition science? I know you finished your PhD in neuroscience and then did some on obesity and eating as a postdoc. How did you fall into this, and what do you do now?
Yeah. So I have been interested in health and nutrition for a long time. I just think it's important. I've always been focused on it. I think it's an important building block to living a good life for a long time. And so I've always had sort of a personal interest in it. And I, for my PhD, I studied neurodegenerative disease in a neuroscience program. And I enjoyed that. And neurodegenerative disease is an interesting topic and a good cause. But I ended up studying a disease that's not very common. And so I wanted to move into a field that was more impactful. And so I decided for my postdoc to kind of bring together my interest in health and nutrition with my interest in neuroscience and study the neuroscience of obesity. And so I did a postdoc with Mike Schwartz at the University of Washington, studying a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is the part that regulates body fatness, and trying to understand how that regulatory system changes in the context of obesity.
Got it. If you don't mind me asking, what was that disease that you were studying that's very rare?
It's called spinocerebellar ataxia type 7. It's it's a polyglutamine repeat disorder. So the disease that is the most common member of that class of diseases is Huntington's disease.
Got it. So we learn about a lot of those different things in medical school, and they end up just being like kind of quick facts that you do on a test that you kind of memorize. And then the second you get into actual medicine, they kind of get thrown out the window unless that ends up being your field. So this is where a lot of that primary research comes from. Our main question on this podcast is geared towards prevention, and kind of nutrition, eating, behavior, and all that kind of lends itself into this. So I'm interested to ask you, what does preventive medicine mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm not a doctor. So if you don't mind, I'm going to step back and
Of course,
kind of answer the question more broadly. What does prevention mean to me? And to me, we've got a big problem in this country, the United States, as well as other affluent industrialized countries. In the United States, for example, the adult obesity rate right now is 43%. So 43% of people don't just carry excess fat mass, but carry enough to be classified as having obesity. And the lifetime obesity rate is over half the lifetime risk of diabetes. In other words, that you would develop diabetes at some point in your life is nearly a third in the United States. So we're talking about extremely high levels of so-called diseases of affluence, diseases that are much less common in non-industrialized societies that live more similarly to how our ancestors live, such as hunter-gatherers and subsistence agriculturalists. And so we're doing something wrong. We're doing a lot right. Obviously, we're doing a lot right as well, but we're doing something wrong. And it has to do with the way that we're eating, the way that we're moving our bodies, and probably a lot of other things as well. And so to me, prevention is about understanding what we can do with our diets and lifestyle to not gain fat as much as most people do, and not develop diseases at the same rate that most people do. And so I think a lot of that revolves around what we're eating. A lot of it revolves around how we're moving our bodies, how we're managing stress, and but also some perhaps less appreciated things, like what our food environment's like. I think, as we'll probably discuss more in this episode, it's not just about what passes our lips. It's not just about the nutritional composition of the food that we're eating. It's about the context that that food is appearing in, and how that is impacting the brain circuits that determine our eating behaviors.
Exactly. I like how you bring up the kind of disease of affluence, because you don't see these typically as often or as prevalent in countries which don't have access to kind of food at your doorstep, easily accessible, like apps to order whatever you want, whenever you want it, at any time of the day, anything like that. So we'll definitely talk about that a little bit later. I like that you brought that up. But obesity is more than just weight. Obviously, we're talking about a very complex disease. There's so much that goes into it, as you're talking about societal factors as well. But there is a component of weight, and everyone who's obese typically carries more weight than they should in the form of fat mass. And the question I have for you is that people have, like, their body weight varies as they age. Typically, people start out in their teenage years, in their early adolescent years, closer to what would be a quote unquote normal weight. And then as time goes on, they kind of add weight. So every time they go to the physician or whoever else, they say, oh, you need to lose some weight. But what is that weight set point? Is there an ideal weight dependent on each individual? How do you find that?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple questions here that we can tease apart. So one question is the question of, is there an ideal weight? And I think that depends on the perspective that you look. The answer to that depends on what your perspective is going to be. So, I mean, if we're talking about like clinically and physiologically, there are certainly some weights, or I should say body fatnesses, that are much more desirable than others, in my opinion. I think being relatively lean from a health perspective is superior to carrying, a substantial amount of excess fat, in terms of particularly diabetes risk, but all the metabolic dysfunctions that are associated with diabetes, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, cardiovascular risk, and risk of many other disorders that come along with that. Um, However, I think there's a different question we can ask as well, which is, for any particular individual who is at whatever weight they're at, what is the ideal weight that they should personally be striving to achieve? Because the problem here is that it's not so easy to modify your weight. And most people know this who have tried to lose weight. People, for example, who have obesity and who have tried to become lean. 2/3 of people with obesity try to lose weight each year in the United States. And so most people with obesity are trying to get leaner every year, and they're just not achieving it. So it's not easy. So the question there is, what is the ideal weight? I mean, should that person just be like totally like pummeling themselves to try to lose as much weight as possible? I don't think so. I think that there's a balance that should be struck that maximizes quality of life, is essentially my way of looking at it. So to me, in that scenario, your ideal weight is the weight that you can comfortably sustain, that kind of strikes the best balance between your health and how you feel and how enjoyable and sustainable your diet and lifestyle are. So that's kind of how I see it in that context. So then there's this other question of why do we gain weight over the course of our lives?
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a foregone conclusion. If you look at, again, if we go back and look at non-industrial cultures like hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers, we find that in many cultures, people do not gain weight as they age. They don't gain fat. If you look at skin fold thickness with age,
Mm-hmm.
or if you look at body mass index, what you see is that it tends to peak around the peak reproductive years, and then it actually either stays stable in the case of fat mass or even declines in the case of body mass index with age. And so this like trajectory of people kind of gaining weight through maybe their 60s or 70s in a country like the US and then starting to decline as they become elderly is not observed consistently in human populations around the world. So I don't think it's correct to think of that as like the human default pattern of body
Mm-hmm.
composition change with age. And so the question then becomes, why do we gain fat over time? And I think we don't have a complete answer to that. But one thing that is clearly happening is that this regulatory system in the brain that tries to maintain the stability of fat mass around a certain set point, as you mentioned, creeps up with age. So people with obesity, they're not just passively at a higher weight. They have a regulatory system in their brain that is regulating around that higher weight. So if they go from lean to having obesity, the obesity is kind of like the new normal to the brain, in the same way that in fever, you have a regulated elevation of body temperature. In certain other conditions, like some kinds of hypertension, you have a regulated increase in blood pressure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of this defense of the elevated fat mass that we see in obesity that is a key characteristic of that state. And that makes it very difficult for those people to sustainably lose weight.
Couple things I want to unpack from there. Number one is that I really appreciate the fact that you brought up that it's not necessarily about getting to that one number on a scale, quote unquote, as ideal weight. Like I have to get down to, let's say, 150 pounds from whatever you may be at. It's about maximizing your quality of life. And that's something that I stress a lot on this podcast. It's not all just about getting to this ideal, quote unquote, state. It's about living your life so that you can do what you enjoy, whatever that may be. If it's running marathons, playing with the grandkids, whatever it may be. So I like that you brought that up. And number two, I want to ask you a little bit more about that set point. So from what you're saying, it sounds like it could be, quote unquote, impossible for someone to kind of that is an obese person to lose weight and get to a non-obese state because of that quote unquote set point that you talked about, because it physiologically becomes harder. If you start out leaner, like let's say you're a teen, like gaining weight throughout your life cycle, as we were talking about, something that set point keeps going up and up and up. And let's say someone's 40 years old, they want to get back to their lean state to maybe practice prevention as they get into their 50s and 60s, reduce their chance of cardiometabolic disease if they didn't have it already. How do you get past that set point? Is it impossible, or is it something that needs to be actively like tackled every single day, or what do you do about it?
So you're talking about if you're someone who already has obesity and you're trying to lose
Yes.
weight?
Yes. Let's
Yeah.
say like a 40-year-old that's trying to get back to what they were maybe in their 20s or even 30s.
Yeah. So I don't want to say it's impossible. It's clearly not impossible. There are people who do it, but I just think it's difficult to lose a large amount of fat and keep it off for a long period of time. And, there's abundant evidence to that effect. If you look at randomized controlled trials, what you find is, you put people on a diet, they'll lose a certain amount of weight, and then generally over time, they will start to regain that. Now we have this new class of drugs, the GLP-1 receptor
Mm-hmm.
agonists, particularly semaglutide, that tends to be a lot more effective than just asking someone to follow a certain diet. and exercise regimen. But that's not to say that diet and exercise are not helpful. I think that, before semaglutide, it was about the best we had, aside from bariatric surgery, of course, which is highly effective. And yeah, so I think there are things that can be done, but I think that if you're just doing a diet and lifestyle strategy, it's you probably shouldn't set your sights on going from having obesity to being lean, because most people are not going to achieve or sustain that. So, sorry to be pessimistic, but I think that is just a fact that I think people should understand. But that doesn't mean that you can't lose weight. And it especially doesn't mean that you can't greatly improve your health, because we have results from studies like the Diabetes Prevention Program trial, where they put people on a diet and lifestyle program for weight loss. They lost 7% of body weight at a few months in. And then by a few years, they were only down by like 4%. But they observed a 58% reduction in the development of type 2 diabetes. So people progressing from prediabetes to diabetes, a 58% reduction in that. So even though they only lost a modest amount of weight over a few years, they still experienced very large improvements in health, at least when it comes to type 2 diabetes development. And so I think that okay, so that said, I think understanding that food intake and body weight are regulated is a very important piece of getting the most out of diet and lifestyle interventions. So, if you don't understand that those things are regulated, you might think that weight loss is easy. All you have to do is just choose to eat fewer calories. You could just count your calories and cut them by a third or cut them by a half, and then you lose weight, no problem, right? I mean, that should be easy if there's no regulatory system pushing back. And you can do that. And in fact, if you're able to stick with it, it will even work. But the problem is that you get a lot of pushback from these regulatory systems. So once your fat mass starts to drop, your leptin levels drop, and then that's a signal to your brain that says that your fat mass is dropping, and your brain will initiate what I call a starvation response. It'll kick in hunger. It'll kick in increased interest in food. It'll start to slow your metabolic rate. And it's this coordinated behavioral and physiological response designed to resist weight loss and regain fat. And so my perspective is, instead of setting up a situation where you're going to be struggling against these regulatory systems, it's better to understand them and try to work with them and possibly even recruit them to help you. And so there are some strategies that I think have that effect. They either impact the set point directly or somehow are working around the set point. So, for example, eating higher protein food is one way of doing that. You increase your protein intake. And what you observe there is that people will spontaneously reduce their calorie intake on a high protein diet without being asked to reduce their calorie intake, without counting calories. It just happens as a result of the impact on these regulatory systems of that higher protein. Another example is macronutrient restriction. So just cutting back on carbohydrate or cutting back on fat has a similar effect. Physical activity, regular physical activity can impact, I think, the set point to some degree and causes better regulation of energy intake. And then I think another thing that's really helpful is modifying your food environment so that you're not receiving cues that are constantly stimulating your motivational systems that plug into your eating drive. Because if you're, you know, if you're constantly surrounded by food cues that are pushing you to eat, you are triggering those non-conscious brain systems that generate your eating drive. And if you don't want to eat, let's say that's not consistent with your diet goals for yourself, you're going to have to exert willpower to combat those urges. And that's the situation that you don't want to be in. So eliminating those cues, the visual cues, the proximity, the smell cues of tempting food from your food environment. So those are just some ideas.
Definitely. I want to ask you about willpower in just a second, because I just saw a great post by one of my friends on Instagram about that. So I'll ask you in just a second. But I also want to say real quickly that this is one of the reasons that we don't tie our fitness, like our exercise routine, and necessarily what we eat to our weight and to our health, because they are all tied together, but they're all somewhat independent. And people tend to have this all or none mentality, unfortunately, where they are already not quote unquote in a healthy state, or they're obese, and they're like, oh, what does it matter if it's all pessimistic, if it's all tied together, then I can't even do anything about it. And no, you're mentioning that there are unique characteristics and unique benefits to exercising regularly, to eating a varied diet full of vegetables, fruits, maybe for specifically eating higher protein, it could still help. There's so many independent health benefits. This is why we don't all marry them together. Now, back to willpower. For some reason, our society has a huge emphasis on willpower. They say if you cannot adhere to this diet, like let's say there's an online coach, which happens unfortunately way too often. There's an online coach that gives someone a diet to lose weight, and the client doesn't. And then all of a sudden they just blame this client has poor willpower. What is it with us and willpower? And what can we do to enhance our willpower? Is there anything we can do about it? Just what's your take on willpower?
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing. Willpower is a thing that people have that can help them achieve their goals. It's not a steamroller that can steamroll over every other brain system we have. We have regulatory systems in our brains, I'll talk about appetite a little bit because that's something that I'm familiar with. We have regulatory systems that push us to eat a certain amount, and you don't have to eat that much. You can choose to eat less. You can exert willpower and eat less, but that's literally one part of your brain fighting against another part of your brain. And is that really the situation we want to be in for, the long term? Is that a sustainable situation? And can you even win? I mean, you could probably win for a day. You could win for a week. Maybe you could win for a month. Could you win for a year against those, non-conscious brain systems that don't agree with what you're trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
I think the evidence suggests most people cannot win for, a year or multiple years. And so I think finding ways to work with those systems is a better approach than, struggling against them and then eventually most people not succeeding. So it's not that willpower isn't, doesn't exist or is totally ineffective. I just think that people overestimate how impactful it is and how much you can rely on it in a situation like this. I mean, these systems, these non-conscious brain systems, they're not designed to be overridden. They're very compelling. I mean, you can override them for a meal or a week or maybe even a year, but they're just going to wear you down. And that's what happens. You look at people who went through the show The Biggest Loser, for example.
Mm-hmm.
They have an incredible amount of pressure on them, right, during that show. And, they're able to do incredible things in terms of their energy balance, energy in versus out, and they lose a ton of weight. But then what happens when they leave the show? Most of them regain a lot of that weight. And so, once they're not in that situation where they're under a tremendous amount of pressure and they're back in their regular lives again, and they have these regulatory systems barking at them every day, all day, to do something different than what they consciously want to do, those systems just aren't designed to be ignored. The system that is activated when you try to diet is a starvation response. It's a physiological and behavioral and motivational program guided by non-conscious parts of your brain that is trying to protect you against starvation, which was historically a grave threat to your survival and reproductive success. And so I think that it's important to think about it in that context. So, it's not that willpower doesn't matter, but it's better to exert a little bit of willpower and a little bit of planning in advance to set up a situation where you're not having to chronically apply large amounts of it.
We want to take a quick break to remind you that this podcast is not intended for medical advice and is for educational and informational purposes only. We also want to remind you of our Instagram page @PreventPod, where we share various content relating to each episode that you can share with your friends if you enjoy our episode. And lastly, don't forget to sign up for our mailing list so you know right away when an episode goes up at www.thepreventivemedicinepodcast.com. And with that, let's get back into this episode. All right, so we have been talking about a variety of influences and factors that go into someone's desire to eat, into their kind of cues of what they're putting into their mouth. We've discussed things from the neuroscientific perspective, for example, our satiety, our urges to eat, some responses to us eating foods. We've talked about some external factors, such as having apps like Uber Eats, all these different apps out there about like a Dunkin' Donuts or McDonald's on every single corner, just impulses to eat, cues to eat. It doesn't sound like we're going to get all of them to ever go our way. Like we're not going to ever be able to move this McDonald's and say, I don't want this here anymore. And it's sometimes very difficult to choose where to live because you can't just say, I'm not going to live anywhere where there's a McDonald's. It's almost impossible, right? Are there certain things to prioritize, you think, that would influence our weight more than others? Like, for example, is it more important to move somewhere away and do the food environment type of thing versus modifying your internal cues? Or does it all just kind of go together?
So are you talking about on a societal level or on an individual level?
Let's go on an individual level first. We'll save the societal for a little bit later.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there is a priority list, but I think it all goes together. So I think there are multiple factors that are important. I think the types of foods that cross your lips are important. We talked about some things about food composition earlier, like protein content. There's also fiber content. There's calorie density, in other words, calories per gram. Those are things that, and there's the palatability, the enjoyment value of the food. Those are all things that impact your eating drive, as well as how much satiety or fullness you experience per calorie that you eat. So those are things that can impact your food intake. There's also your food environment, which I think is very important. So food environment, I think, is probably the main thing that's changed corresponding with the development of the obesity epidemic since the 1980s. And then I think physical activity is important too. I don't think physical activity causes a lot of weight loss, but I think it's probably more powerful in preventing weight gain to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also probably more powerful with weight loss maintenance than it is in weight loss per se.
Definitely. I can agree with that. I would say food environment is probably the biggest thing for myself. I lost around 70 to 80 pounds. I have a podcast with one of my co-hosts previously that we kind of discussed our different journeys. And I think for both of us that was our primary thing, where once we kind of built a kind of different environment, that we fell into different patterns and we didn't have the urge to like, oh, there's a cookie in the cupboard, let me go eat one. Can't just have one Oreo, you have to have 2, 3, that kind of thing. So it was definitely very important. I want to also ask you, Lee, you mentioned a little bit about our food environment and how that's changed since the 1980s, even previously, maybe a little bit, especially since our ancestral days, as some people love to point out on social media. But also people tend to blame specific nutrients. They say it's the sugar. They say it's the fat. No one says it's the protein, thankfully. But what do you think about this? And is there something to specifically blame for the obesity epidemic? Like it was that, or is it kind of all once again going together?
Yeah. So I don't think there's any single thing we can blame the obesity epidemic on, and certainly not a specific nutrient. But if we look at, so the first point I want to make is that the obesity rate has been increasing for a long time, even long before the 1980s. It's just been a slower process up until somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. But if you look back at obesity rate, the data are not real good, but from what we have, obesity rates in around 1900, they're something like 1/20th of what they are today. So huge differences in the rates of obesity, and particularly class 2 or class 3 obesity. So people who are above body mass index of 35 or 40. So people who really have very pronounced obesity. That was, I mean, virtually non-existent back then. And so the reason I say this is because, this has actually been a process that's been in the works for a long time, I think. And if you look over that period, what you see is a very profound shift in how we interact with food in the United States. And all that I was talking about, that's all US data, because that's the data I know the best. But basically, the big picture is we have outsourced the preparation of food from our own kitchens to the food industry and restaurants. So if you look at what people did around 1900, almost all food was purchased in stores as single ingredients, made into food in the home and consumed there. Whereas now the majority of our food expenditures is actually on food that we eat away from home. And even the food we do eat at home, a lot of that is food that's processed that we're just buying fully prepared and bringing home and eating. So there's been a very profound shift in how we interact with food. And one aspect of that corresponds particularly well with the obesity epidemic is a large increase in snacking. So if you look at calorie intake, it goes up around the time the obesity epidemic emerged, and that increase in calories can be accounted for by the increase in snacking frequency that occurred. So people started eating more of these kind of processed savory snacks between meals. People started drinking sugar sweetened beverages more between meals. That was also part of that change. And that was all in coordination with a huge marketing effort from the food industry that occurred over that period of time. It started in the mid 70s and ramped up through the mid 80s and 90s. And so essentially we had this massive change in food culture and how we interact with food that corresponded with this huge increase in food marketing that some people would hypothesize is a major driver of the obesity epidemic. And I think that story makes sense. But, we don't have randomized controlled trials where we rerun US history while manipulating variables. So, this is, us guessing at what happened based on the evidence that we have. But I think, there are all kinds of ideas of, it was all caused by sugar or it was all caused by carbs. I think those are two, of the more popular ideas that are prevalent right now. If you go back and look at the US diet in 1909, 1920, it was very high in carbohydrate. 1900, it was very high in carbohydrate. And it wasn't whole grains. It was mostly white flour. And it was a fair amount of sugar too, actually. The amount of sugar that we're eating right now is not that much higher than what people were eating in the 1920s in the US. And again, that was not like they weren't chewing on pieces of sugar cane. We're talking about white sugar. So, and I'm not saying that's good for you. I think that they had a pretty bad diet back then in many ways, but it wasn't giving them obesity, and it wasn't leading to the types of diabetes rates that we're seeing today. So I think basically that, people want to have like the nutrient that they can pin stuff on. It's not that simple. If you look at the literature overall, what you see is that the most fattening place to be is right in the middle, a diet that is rich in both carbohydrate and fat. If you reduce either one of those, you get a diet that's more slimming in animal models of obesity and in humans. So in humans, low fat diets cause weight loss in people with obesity. Low carb diets cause weight loss in people with obesity. And we could argue about which one is more effective, but they both cause weight loss. And so we need some kind of model that explains that. And that model is not carbs are fattening or fat is fattening. That's
Exactly.
a model that's that simple, just cannot account for the evidence that we have in both humans and animal models of obesity. And so, carbs are fattening, fat is fattening, but what the fattening place to be is right in the middle, where you're eating lots of both of those and where they're being combined into these extremely calorie dense, delectable, dopamine stimulating combinations that trigger our eating drive and that have a very low level of satiety because of their physical and chemical properties.
And that definitely plays out in the real world. No one's getting fat eating sweet potatoes, which are 100% carbohydrate. No one's getting fat drinking pure oil. I mean, maybe there's someone out there doing that, but for the most part, it's the combination that makes them, as you're saying, hyper palatable, gives you that dopamine rush, and always feels good. And this is why in restaurants, they always add a fair amount of fat to kind of all of the food that you eat. So if anyone's out there kind of consciously eating the food at restaurants, trying to track your macros, always overestimate on fat, because that's what makes things hyper palatable, especially if you're eating like fries or any other sort of rice. There's a lot of butter in that as opposed to when you cook at home. That's why it always tastes better. So that's one little thing there. Number two is that it sounds like it's a process of commercialization, whereas companies and fast food companies and just restaurants in general try to raise their profits and just make more money, that they're going to make their foods more palatable so that people keep coming back, so that people say, oh, this food tastes really good. And it doesn't look like that's going to change at any point. Sure, we have these healthy, quote unquote, fast food places now that promise to be a healthier alternative to McDonald's. However, they still provide relatively hyperpalatable foods that contribute to excess caloric intake. Is there anything we can do about that? Because in my eyes, that trend's only going to continue. And right now, as you're mentioning at the beginning of this, we're at around 42% prevalence of obesity. And I don't see the number slowing down. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, I think it's really tough because, we live in a capitalist system, and I think there's many ways in which that's good, but there's a race in the food industry. There's this brutal competition where if you're trying to sell as much as possible of your product, and if it's not extremely appealing to customers, it's going to lose out to the next product that is extremely appealing. And a lot of what people are buying today are processed foods, right? So you have this competition happening between processed foods, where only the ones that are the most appealing survive. So these foods are being selected in the marketplace based on their impact on our brain motivational systems, right? So
Exactly.
they're being selected for the foods that maximally drive purchase and consumption behaviors. And I don't think these food industry corporations, I don't think they're trying to make people, have obesity. I just think
I
it's
hope not.
yeah, I don't think there's anybody like smoking cigars and talking about how they can drive the obesity epidemic, but I do think that it's a natural consequence of selecting for foods that maximally stimulate purchase and consumption behaviors, because that is what's being selected for in the competitive marketplace, right? So, and then it happens to be true that foods that are maximally motivating to our purchase and consumption behaviors also tend to have properties that produce low satiety per calorie. And so I think these are the kinds of foods that we're highly motivated to purchase and eat. And then they don't like we tend to overconsume them because per calorie, they just don't create physical sensations of fullness to the same degree. And I say physical sensations, that's of course those are sensations generated by the brain based on feedback from your gastrointestinal tract. So yeah, I think this is a very difficult situation because what are you going to do? Like, are we going to, just dictate that corporations can't sell these types of foods?
Yeah.
Are we going to reverse the forces of capitalism? I think it's a very challenging situation, and I don't think nothing can be done. I think we could actually have a big impact, but I think that the types of regulations that would be required to have a big impact are not palatable to the public or to the government. I think people would recoil. I think it would be viewed as authoritarian. So I'm kind of pessimistic about like overhauling our food system sufficiently to reverse the obesity epidemic. That said, I don't think that nothing can be done. I think there are some things that are potentially promising that we could try. I think, there are certain foods that I think pretty much everyone agrees are unhealthy, like sugar sweetened beverages, for example. I think, everybody, there's not a lot of debate about whether those are healthy or not, right? So things that everybody can get behind and say maybe we could impose a tax on those things. And, sometimes I hear people say they're like, it's punishing poor people. I'm like, what punishes poor people is diabetes.
Medical costs associated with diabetes. It's absurd.
Yeah. I really don't see much of a counter argument to taxing a food like sugar sweetened beverages. And so, yeah, so I think that there are some approaches that we could take that I think would be helpful. I think around food advertising. I think, food advertising to children, like, can we agree that that's not a great thing? There's already limits on it. And in the UK, I know they've placed limits on it, but like, I think there are things that I think most people can get behind. But the reality is that most people, the average person today, is eating over 200 calories more than the average person was before the obesity epidemic. So we're not going to reverse that by beating around the bush with half measures. If we want to cause that to go away, we're going to have to take very stringent measures, and I don't think those are going to be palatable to the average person. That said, I want to add that we have, the medical management of obesity is radically changing right now as a result of these new drugs. So I am optimistic on that front. I think that even though I have a hard time seeing the obesity epidemic reverse as a result of public health measures, maybe we could chip away at it a little bit. And then coupled with better medical management of obesity, maybe we could catch people early and say, okay, we've identified this person as being on a trajectory where, they're soon going to be have obesity. Let's offer them one of these new drugs, and maybe we can stop them from progressing and, help them achieve their own body composition goals more easily.
Definitely. I'll ask you a little bit more about the medical aspect of this in just a second, kind of where healthcare providers and physicians kind of play into this. But I want to ask you and kind of bring up one other thing, which is on a systems level, we're kind of pessimistic because now you get into political views, you get into lobbying. There's just so much to get through that I don't also think or foresee any changes coming that way. But one of the things that I have been kind of aware of, I'm not as well read on this data. I can't pull studies out of my bank right now. I'll get there at some point. But I have seen some data, some promising things where people who are encouraged to kind of pick out their own fresh fruits, vegetables, who are taught how to cook tend to have a lower caloric intake, and they're able to prepare these foods at home. I think there's a trial, another guest of mine was mentioning, where they have people from lower socioeconomic incomes that don't necessarily have access and can't purchase all these things for themselves, that were not only provided these things, but also taught how to cook. And they tended to have lower caloric intakes and quote unquote better diets. So I think that is something that seems to be promising. I don't know how much you know on the data on this. You probably know a lot more than me, but it seems that cooking is probably a gateway at a community level, at least, where you have community cooking classes. Like, these are the vegetables, this is how you would prepare this vegetable. So now I can make vegetables more palatable instead of having rice from the restaurant where they have like a whole stick of butter in there. You make your own rice, which will still taste pretty good, and then you can have a side of vegetables or something. Do you know much data on that?
It's not an area that I've been following very closely. From what I understand, the data is pretty thin that interventions like that can have a substantial impact on obesity rates. Um, I think that, um, I mean, I think there is potential in those areas. I just don't think, from what I understand, and again, I'm not really on the cutting edge, but from what I
Mm-hmm.
understand, the evidence isn't very strong in terms of direct impacts on actual obesity rates. Um, but, looking back, like, cultural, societal changes are what got us here, right? And so maybe cultural and societal changes could take us back. I don't know. Maybe
Exactly.
maybe over time we will develop kind of a better cultural immune system against this fattening food environment that we live in, and maybe people will, be able to develop better habits and norms around diet. Um,
Yeah,
but I
I'm
think
just
we're talking
spitballing
about,
here.
yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about large changes that would need to be implemented generationally, and
Hmm.
I'm open to stuff like that. I mean, it would be a satisfying solution, but I think, the big question, would it work, is one that I think is unanswered.
Agreed. And I asked this because this kind of ties into the next question is we talked about from an individual level how it's often very difficult to kind of overcome urges, overcome societal pressures, cues to eat. We talked about how from a large systems level, we have food advertising, we have hyperpalatable foods that kind of survive in a capitalistic system and a market. But then we have kind of this little space of, we have kind of communities, we have physicians, and we have healthcare outreach to these communities. And this is kind of where I would fit in as a healthcare provider and a physician, where what can I do for not only my patient in front of me, but for the community at large that I serve? Let's say my hospital is part of this zip code. What can we do as a hospital to kind of improve it? So where do you see this kind of fitting in?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that I am more optimistic about preventing the development of obesity through diet and lifestyle than I am about reversing existing obesity. I think once a person has that elevated set point, that becomes very challenging to reverse that. It's probably easier. I don't have strong evidence to support this, but I would think it would be probably easier to prevent that from happening in the first place rather than try to reverse it. Um, and so to me, anything you could do to just try to uh, cultivate healthy diet, healthy habits, regular physical activity in the community would be helpful. So, you know, teaching cooking skills, not putting a stick of butter in your rice, um, and teaching people how to prepare whole foods and emphasizing the importance of that, limiting added fats, added sugars, um, refined carbohydrates, um, and trying to build physical activity into the day, building a supportive food environment where they're not going to be tempted in their own home or at workplace all the time, and trying to normalize, like, not having donuts in the break room every day. Um, and yeah, so those are some ideas. I tend to think a really important concept is trying to build physical activity into your daily routine such that it's not something you have to think about. So have it, for example, as your commute if you can, or part of your commute. Some people drive, they have to drive a long way, but maybe you could park a few miles away and walk the rest or bike the rest. So those are just some ideas. But I think, on the treatment side, now, of course, we have this incredible new tool, the semaglutide or Wegovy, and that opens a lot of doors, I think, as well as, the other options, bariatric surgery, and then diet and lifestyle programs, I think, have also experienced some evolution and refinement over time in terms of being able to provide a cost-effective platform that supports people in adhering to healthy diet and lifestyle behaviors.
Definitely. I think one of my previous biases had been kind of more towards caloric restriction, willpower, you can lose weight. Like I mentioned, I did lose a significant amount of weight, and like, if I could do it, anyone can do it. Why not? But then you realize, when you look through literature, when you gain clinical acumen, when you actually start seeing patients, no, this isn't what happens. So my personal bias has kind of been moving more towards that treatment option, as you were talking about, Wegovy. And now I also saw you tweeting about the recent drug, which was tirzepatide, I believe.
Yeah.
And there's just so many promising results. And also bariatric surgery, which we had Dr. Austin Chiang, who's the director of bariatric endoscopy, I believe, at a Jefferson, who talked about it. We talked a lot about that with him. I think there's just so much going on the treatment side now. But as you're saying, this is the Preventive Medicine podcast. So I think what we can do right now to promote better healthy behaviors for parents, so that they can kind of instill them in their children. So that is that generational thing that gets passed down. So we're not every Friday getting fast food from someplace. Instead, let's build a culture of every Friday night we sit down as a family, we like cook food ourselves, and we have that. I think those are very valuable, and I think that's something that I love that you brought up.
Yeah, I think that is important. Like, if you do the cross-cultural comparisons, I mean, look at the obesity rates in France. Look at the obesity rates in Italy. Look at the obesity rates even in Canada. They're lower, and in some cases much lower. Japan. You have, obesity rates are way lower in Japan, but if you look at Japanese Americans, people who emigrated to the United States, they get obesity at nearly the same rates as people who are European descent. And so it's not a genetic thing, or at least it's not mostly a genetic thing. It's mostly a cultural thing. So I do believe culture is very important. The only thing is, how do you change culture? That's the tough part,
If only.
Yeah, I think these are the countries I mentioned. These are all countries. Well, I don't know, maybe with the exception of Canada. I don't know as much about Canada, but like France, Italy, Japan, like, they're countries that have very strong food cultures and traditions, right? And so the United States is not like that. We're just kind of like a mishmash, uh, and of different cultures, and there's not like strong like cultural norms about food. Like,
I think
uh,
if anything, it would be speed. Speed seems to be the main difference, based on my travels at least, where everything you
yeah,
want here to be done
speed,
fast.
efficiency, low
Exactly.
cost. Yeah. Um, yeah, there's not as much of a focus on, like in France, there's a million rules around food. And here it's like many households don't even sit down for a meal together. They just kind of like graze all day.
Exactly.
So, which would be like abhorrent, totally abhorrent to most French people. And so, like, yeah. So anyway, I'm just agreeing with you. I think culture actually is really important. It's hard to quantify, it's hard to study, and it's hard to modify.
And this is exactly why I wanted you on the podcast, because when people think of nutrition, they think of, like we are talking about, the calories in, calories out, that kind of thing. And then sometimes people will go to the neuroscience, but it's seldom that someone starts talking about the culture behind food and how that impacts people's dietary choices, the obesity rates in various countries. And I really appreciate having you on the show for that. We got one last question for you, and it's probably the most annoying question that I'm going to ask you. And that is, if you are at your local Starbucks or your local roaster getting a cup of coffee and someone recognizes you, says, "Hey, Dr. Guyenet, how do I get healthy?" What do you tell them in 2 minutes?
I would say eat a lower calorie density, whole food based diet, and get physical activity every day if you can, or almost every day.
Perfect. That's way less than 2 minutes. Looks like your coffee is ready. Where can people find you? What do you want people to know about yourself? I'll make sure all the links are everywhere. I'll put it in the intro so that people know where to find you.
So I'm most active on Twitter. I'm at sguyenet, so SGUYENET. I have a website called stephanguyenet.com. And I also have, if you're interested in reading the expert book reviews that my organization publishes, Red Pen Reviews, that's at redpenreviews.org.
And once again, all of those links will be provided in the show notes and throughout Instagram, wherever I post all this stuff. So once again, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you did as well.
Okay, thank you.
All right, take care.